So I want to speak briefly about archaea. Archaea are prokaryotes too because they have no organelles, but remember they are an entirely different domain from bacteria, meaning they are as different from bacteria as they are from you. Archaea actually have properties of both bacteria and of eukarya, so they're sort of in between in a way. As I mentioned in the last in the first week, the first life on Earth was probably most like archaea because archaea tend to inhabit environments that resemble those on the young Earth. They are extremophiles, meaning they like extreme environments. They're also extremely durable, so they can survive enormous temperature extremes. They can survive high doses of radiation. They can survive under rocks and in ocean floor vents deep below the ocean surface. They can tolerate huge changes in pressure, like if they started in the deep ocean and then got dislodged and came to the surface, they could survive that huge change in pressure. There are some similarities between archaea and bacteria, which I'll list here. They're both single-celled organisms exclusively. All archaea and all bacteria, they're all single-celled organisms. None of them have organelles, so they both get lumped into the category prokaryotes because of that. They both have a single circular chromosome, and they also both carry plasmids, those smaller circular rogue genetic elements. The shapes are the same between archaea and bacteria. That's maybe not so surprising because how many shapes can a single-celled organism take on, really? But the same shapes that you use to that you can use to identify some bacteria, you can use those same shapes are found in archaea. They both have flagella. Not all bacteria and not all archaea have flagella, but some of them do. So you can find flagella in both domains. They both have cell membranes. I mean, all cells have cell membranes, but that's something that links the two. You find a cell wall in both archaea and bacteria, which is not true of all eukaryotes. But there are some important differences. So the differences between them mostly have to do with their biochemistry. For example, even though they both have cell membranes, the molecule that makes their cell membrane is different. And we'll look here. You don't have to memorize these structures. I'm just showing you how these phospholipids differ. So these are two different kinds of phospholipids. The one on top is what you find in archaea. It has these branched isoprene chains instead of these unbranched fatty acid chains in their phospholipids. And there's also some subtle differences in this, in this group here that's between the lipid and the phosphate group. So the molecules that build their plasma membrane are different between archaea and bacteria. Also, their cell wall is not made of peptidoglycan. It's made out of a different disaccharide called pseudomurin. It's still a disaccharide that gets linked up in these big sheets to build a cell wall, and the function of the cell wall is the same for archaea and bacteria. It's to protect against osmotic stress, against the pressure of water overfilling the cell. But it's just a different disaccharide. Even though you find flagella in archaea and you find flagella in bacteria, the protein that builds the flagella is different in the two domains. Also, most archaea do not need oxygen to survive, but most bacteria do. You do find some aerobic or oxygen-requiring archaea, and you do find some anaerobic bacteria, but the norm is different in the two domains. So the norm for archaea is to be anaerobic, or not needing oxygen. The norm for bacteria is to be aerobic. Again, this suggests the early evolutionary history of archaea because the early Earth did not have much oxygen in the atmosphere, so there were not aerobic organisms. The first organisms to evolve were not aerobic. Okay, so that there's a lot of reasons scientists think archaea are most like the earliest organisms on the planet, so that's one reasoning. Another indication they may have been first residents on the planet is that they use a variety of energy sources aside from organic molecules. So organic molecules like sugars, fats, proteins, those kinds of organic molecules are built by living things. So if you're going to use sugar, there have to be other living things around. Like we eat sugar and fats, we get it from other living things. We eat plants and animals which are alive. So organic molecules are built by living organisms, and so The first life on the planet would not have been able to sustain itself off of organic molecules because organic molecules were not readily available until the planet was teeming with life. So in the beginning, other energy sources would have to be found. A couple of examples of inorganic molecules that archaea can use for energy are hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, but there are many more. So these are inorganic molecules that contain enough energy that an organism, a simple organism like archaea, could sustain its energy needs off of these molecules. Archaea also share a number of biochemical properties with eukarya. For one thing, the DNA is associated with histones. You might remember from your prereqs that histones are proteins that help eukaryotes supercoil and organize their DNA. So for our cells, for example, there's 6 feet of DNA inside every single one of your cells. That's a lot of genetic information and it has to be organized. So eukaryotes are proteins that the DNA is wrapped around. It's sort of like, to keep your thread organized, you wrap it around a spool. Well, the same way our DNA gets wrapped around histones. That's true for eukaryotic cells like ours, and it's true for archaea, but it's not true for bacteria. Bacteria don't have histones. You should also remember from your prereqs that translation, there's transcription of DNA into RNA, translation of RNA into protein. So translation in eukaryotic ribosomes begins when they find 5' AUG, 5' AUG 3', which codes for methionine. So there's this start codon. Eukaryotes, we have a start codon that tells the ribosome, start here for translation, start here for building the protein. And that start codon codes for methionine, and so all eukaryotic proteins begin with methionine. This is also true for archaea, but it's not true for bacteria. Archaea and eukarya also have similar enzymes involved in gene expression and in metabolism. Now, I want to emphasize you do not have to memorize all these differences and similarities between archaea and bacteria or between archaea and eukaryota. What I do want you to remember is just that structurally, archaea are more similar to bacteria. So archaea and bacteria look the same under a microscope. Structurally, archaea and bacteria are more similar. But biochemically, physiologically, archaea are more similar to eukarya. So physically, morphologically, structurally, archaea is more similar to bacteria. Biochemically, physiologically, archaea are more similar to eukarya.